Hi, Mindy. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to talk to you today about compulsive overeating, something I think many people can relate to. So we all have a story in how we end up by doing what we do. So can you tell us about yours?
Absolutely. But first, thank you, Tiffany, for the opportunity to do so
Yeah, you're
and
welcome.
share my experience, strength, and hope. So, my interest and what has become a soul driven passion for a functional eating disorder recovery model was born out of my personal experience with recovery. You see, for more than 20 years of my adult life, I carried the weight, the burden of an obsessive fear of what food would do to me.
Mhm.
I had no conception of what food could do for me. So, of course, I could not embrace that concept. I restricted my food. I was at one point 2 pounds away from being hospitalized. I had episodes of binge eating, compulsively overeating, and I consistently purged. And my life was taking twists and turns, both in and out of my control. So my recovery experience was very conventional, very traditional. When I had hit bottom, I was in my late 30s. I knew I needed help. My daughters were teenagers. My husband was vacillating between resenting me and blaming himself. My health was truly in jeopardy. I was suffering from depression, mood swings, GI disorders, what I didn't understand at the time with blood sugar dysregulation. So I went to see our family doctor, who was very supportive and very kind,
Mhm.
and set me up with a recovery protocol. Um, as I had said, I was 2 pounds away from being hospitalized, and for me, that was out of the question. It was the 90s. There weren't these beautiful spa-like residential facilities at that time. It was going to mean that I was going to be admitted to probably the psych ward of a local hospital, and that was just not going to do it for
Right.
me. So here I was doing recovery. I was going for my weekly weigh-ins. I was seeing my therapist sometimes twice weekly, and I was meeting with a dietitian. I was being told what I needed to weigh, what I needed to think and feel, and what I needed to eat.
Mhm.
It wasn't going to be sustainable for me because nobody was connecting me to the wisdom of my body. All of these practices, the visits, the doctor visits, the therapy visits, the meal plans were still keeping me up here.
Right.
I wasn't connected, and I certainly was not feeling empowered.
Mhm.
Again, doing recovery is very different from being recovered. So through a whole series of life events, I was widowed at 49. That plunged me deep into the depths of addictive behaviors and totally stripped me of everything that even the doing recovery was benefiting.
Mhm.
So I was in my 50s, and I decided it was time to basically reinvent myself, start telling a different story, writing a different story. And I learned about the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, and I enrolled and I became a board certified health coach. Through that training, I learned about the Institute for the Psychology of Eating, which opened up a whole new world for
Mhm.
me because I started to understand who I was as an eater. And then through that program, I was introduced to the concept of functional medicine, which is basically nutrition and lifestyle medicine. And through studying functional medicine nutrition, I learned that all systems of the body are connected. Every body is unique. And yes, everything and everybody matters. And I was able to put together these trainings and my own experience with recovery to come up with what I like to refer to as an unconventional approach to disordered eating or eating disorder recovery, which brings in the physiology piece, which brings in the biology, which really helps you honor your story as you learn that the eating disorder, the disordered behaviors are not the problem. They started out as a brilliant solution. So we look at context, the context within which these behaviors are flourishing,
Mhm.
and we go from there.
Yeah, that's amazing because, we talked a little bit off recording about the phrase emotional eating.
Yes.
And part of that with any type of addiction is that we are trying to block emotion, and we're trying to hide from what's, we're trying to not feel. And so I love that you highlight, I never thought of it that way, that it can kind of have a negative context to it, because we should feel, whatever those feelings might be. And so we maybe just sort of self-perpetuate if we're in this emotional eating mindset. And so I love how you talk about your unconventional approach, because that's getting down to that root cause of helping to deal with the feelings or the biology, or, that maybe kind of can exacerbate those symptoms of overeating. And I love that, because it connects with how I work with people, getting to the root cause of people with their, their symptoms by looking at nutrient deficiencies, which so often affects, the mental health and our behaviors and how we interact with food and anything else. So I love that we're on the same page with that.
Yes, and to speak to what you spend so much time on your podcast delving into about root cause resolution and people struggling with symptoms for so long without having any resolution, being stuck in their symptoms, because most of the practitioners that they see are trained in symptom management.
Right.
We're trained in system management.
Right.
And there's a very big difference. And as we were talking before we hit record, that so many of us, particularly women, are told that, well, your resistant weight loss is a function of the fact that you're postmenopausal. Or maybe it's your stress. It's all in your head. Well, what's stress, yes, has a lot to do with our thoughts and our beliefs and our feelings. But very often, our nutrition can be feeding that anxiety. Our blood sugar dysregulation is feeding that anxiety. Blood sugar dysregulation very often shows up as a panic attack, as an anxiety. And if you are somebody that has an unhealthy relationship with food, if your relationship with food is your method of self-soothing, if your relationship with food is holding you hostage, what are you going to do when you're feeling anxious? You're going to eat or restrict. So then we have this whole vicious cycle when we can just start simply with gut health and blood sugar regulation.
That's huge, and that should be, and that for me, that's sort of at the core of the programs I take people through. And they don't even quite realize that that's what we're working on, because with eating just at baseline, the food availability that most people have had through their lifetime, or the things that we've been sort of trained to think as healthy, just that alone can cause blood sugar dysregulation, let alone anybody who has, the struggle with eating in healthy way, the mentality behind it. And so dealing with those things is really, really important to overcome, many of our symptoms, but for sure the obsessive compulsive overeating, that occurs.
No question. But having said all that, a very big part of disordered eating behaviors come from disordered thinking. A belief system, messaging that was interpreted a certain way.
Right.
Maybe there was trauma long ago. And what we're also finding out now is that there is a huge genetic component to eating disorders. Anywhere from 50 to 85%, depending on whose statistics you're reading, backs up the fact that there is a genetic component. So that also brings into mind what's going on in there. How do we back it up? And we know now, thanks to the science of epigenetics, that genes need not be our destiny, and that we can mitigate that genetic expression through diet and lifestyle.
Yes, that's so important, because I think of my training in genetics just from undergrad, even just from kind of genetics 101. That was the thing. If you have X genes, you're going to have X disease. And it was just sort of a concrete idea, and that was going to be your path. And it was kind of scary, when you think of some of the things you learn about in your science education. And so the fact that you know, like I said, it need not be the destiny. You know, that should give people a lot of hope that if you feel like you've been sort of saddled with compulsive overeating, it doesn't really have to stay just because it's in your family.
Yeah. And then a really big part of what patients need to know, and practitioners, is that, as I said before, the disordered eating, the eating disorder is not the problem. It started out as that solution.
Mm-hmm.
The behaviors show up at a time for them to stay in the world they find themselves in.
Right.
Eventually, the behaviors start taking them away from the world, the one where there's opportunity and possibility for healing and growth, even if it's post-traumatic growth, right?
Right.
And they can step into a new world where they no longer need the disordered behaviors. So they need to know that their thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors emerged as a way to express the emotion that they find too uncomfortable to address.
Yeah, that's huge for overcoming and for healing, for sure.
Exactly. And think about how empowering it is to help our patients and clients realize that there's a strong biological component in this as well, that it's not all in their heads.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yes.
I often share this story because it hit me so hard when it was brought to me. I was working with a woman in her early 40s who needed to be admitted for inpatient treatment for anorexia. And she needed to be medically stabilized before she could go to one of these residential treatment centers. So she ended up in a hospital-based program where the food, of course, was typical hospital food.
Yeah.
And I remember her telling me when I went to visit her that the dinner that she was forced to eat, and when I say forced to eat, if she didn't finish everything that was on her plate, she was going to have to drink 1 or 2 cans of Ensure. Not only that, but she was going to lose phone privileges of speaking with her husband and children that evening.
Wow.
How demoralizing is that?
Mm-hmm.
But the
Punitive.
part that really got to me about the functional nutrition piece, why I share this story, is that this woman suffers from Crohn's and colitis. And the meal that she was being forced to eat was lasagna and garlic knots. High gluten, high dairy. And when she complained about the GI upset and the digestive distress that she was feeling, instead of somebody looking into what her body was doing with the food that she was being forced to eat, she was sent for another therapy session. Tiffany, it breaks my heart.
That's awful. I'm speechless. I just can't even imagine the
It breaks,
trauma.
it breaks
It
my
caused
heart.
more trauma.
Yes. But now this woman is labeled, and how she's identifying too,
Mm-hmm.
with this person who you know is not all there mentally and psychologically, when that
Right.
is not the case.
Right.
When that is not the case. So that's why my unconventional approach does not prescribe to an all foods fit diet, which is what the conventional
Mm-hmm.
protocols call for now. It's basically exposure therapy,
Mm-hmm.
telling patients and clients that in order to prove that they are committed to their recovery, they have to be willing to eat everything. I've heard stories about patients being served Pop-Tarts and donuts.
Mm-hmm.
And again, having punitive actions taken if they don't finish. There's something wrong with that system.
You wonder what their success rate is in those types of programs. I wonder if there's any statistics on that we could look at.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. Statistics. Almost 30 million people in this country suffer from eating disorders. 10 million of them are men. 13% of them are over the age of 50.
Wow.
The number of children under the age of 12 that have been hospitalized for eating disorders in the last decade has increased, ready for this, 119%.
Unbelievable. That is alarming.
And the clients that I see, mostly women that I work with, that I'm blessed to work with, that walk into my office or now meet me on Zoom
Mm-hmm.
from all over the world, are finding that the treatment protocols that they have been introduced to are not sustainable because they're not addressing the root cause. And yet there are other root causes besides the GI
Mm-hmm.
and the hormone. It's all about story.
Mm-hmm.
It's how your biography becomes your biology.
Right.
We know in the study of adverse childhood experiences that our brain development can be skewed
Mm-hmm.
because of trauma, whether it's big T or little t in
Mm-hmm.
childhood. It's how we interpreted the messages that were given. It's how we interpret the experience at the family table that dictates our relationship with food and our bodies. So there's so much to it. It's such a multifaceted treatment and problem. It needs to be a very multifaceted approach.
Right. And I think we underestimate how those experiences and, from childhood or, even a little bit older children, adolescents,
Yeah.
college age, how those things can live in our bodies forever if we don't even know that they're bothering us, or we have to really peel back the layers to dig into some of those things with dealing with some, again, actually feel through the feelings and acknowledge them. And there's so much research out there too showing how it does actually live in our bodies
Yes,
and we feel
absolutely.
it. Hmm.
Right. And while we're talking about clinically diagnosed eating disorders,
Hmm.
I think we need to also pay homage to the disordered eater,
Right.
right? The person, the man, woman, or child, teen, who is just being bombarded with misinformation that is being driven by misguided beliefs.
Right.
Going down the rabbit hole of social media, the influencers that are out there saying, eat this, don't eat that.
Hmm.
That's presenting a huge problem. And disordered eating needs to get its time as well. But what this distinguishes disordered eating from full-blown eating disorder is basically all about degree,
Right.
right? An individual with disordered eating is often engaged in some of the same behaviors as those with full-blown eating disorders, but at a lesser frequency,
Hmm.
and of course a lower level of severity and a lower level of consequences, physically and
Right.
like psychiatric.
Hmm. Yeah, it is one of those things where I think we get some of it starts sort of innocently,
Mhm.
where okay, I'm gonna try to eat more healthy, and like you said, from social media, from the news, from the newspaper, from magazine articles, it's a lot of vanity type of things, and
Mhm.
so we get conditioned to believe in these different rules about food or different things we should try and eat and just ways of eating and actual diets. And I think people get so bogged down in all of the minutia of it and don't even know where to go. So they just kind of are dabbling all the time and become very disordered and sort of panic eating. And I think over time it just sort of snowballs into a bigger problem. And then they become pre-diabetic, and then they become, to the point where they have issues with maybe fatty liver. And then this sadly gets trickled down into our children, that whole
Absolutely.
lifestyle.
No question. And, and then of course, even all of this information out there, a
Hmm.
high fact diet. My mentor, Mark David, who is the founder of the Institute for the Psychology of Eating, put out a question recently, about, is all of this nutritional information out there the new eating disorder?
Hmm.
Because people are just so confused with everything that's out there. And, truthfully, I know some practitioners who are guilty of perpetuating all of
Hmm.
this with the dogma.
Hmm.
Therapeutic protocols are not meant to be followed forever.
Right.
They are meant to be temporary, to reverse issues and deficiencies, because
Mm-hmm.
some of them can create deficiencies,
Mm-hmm.
right? Certain elimination diets in time will create deficiencies that will create symptoms that we have to address. And then there's the person who's struggling with a chronic illness, particularly GI issues,
Mm-hmm.
who basically become fearful of what food will do to them
Mm-hmm. Right.
because of the pain and the symptoms that they're suffering. So it takes a practitioner with empathy, of course, knowledge and compassion to help someone realize that while they're the expert of their experience, they can also be empowered to become the master of their own healing. But that only happens when we learn to listen to the wisdom of our bodies.
Right. So is that what you would say? One of the questions I have for you is, what patients need to know with regard to their recovery. Is that part of what you would say to that? Or how else would you answer that?
Yeah. What they need to know about their own recovery is that they can be the master of their own healing. And
Mm-hmm.
how that happens is by exploring the story that got them to where they are, exploring the toxic and the inflammatory beliefs that got them there. Functional medicine very often is all about elimination diets.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my work with clients starts off with the elimination of inflammatory thoughts, not
Right.
so much foods.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, we go to building a sense of sufficiency where there's deficiency. So not only are we looking at nutritional deficiencies, we're looking at where are they deficient in their lives. Again,
Mm-hmm.
how are they sleeping? What are their relationships about? Are they part of community? Are they engaged in appropriate movement that honors their body as opposed to punishing it in
Mm-hmm.
an effort to make it go away or change?
Right.
Right? Of course, how well hydrated are they? What is their purpose? What kind of spirituality do they ascribe to? So many of us are deficient in these areas of our lives, and that deficiency plays out in our relationship with food. Very often people think that if they improve their relationship with food, their life will improve. It's the other way around. So that's how I
Mm-hmm.
explain to people. It's your relationship to self that is reflected in your relationship to everything else. And
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with nutrition and lifestyle.
Right. Yes, it's not something outside of ourselves so much. We're always looking for that magic bullet, something to be able to take care of what's going on there that we don't like, the things that we don't like, in the form of punitive exercise, like because we want to exercise to burn X many calories, to lose weight or build muscle, whatever it is. And maybe that's not the right thing to do at this time, or whatever time you're trying to go through recovery. So is that why some things like that, is that why recovery is so elusive for so many? Or what other things would you say
Yeah.
contribute to that?
I talk about 4 blocks to recovery. The first one is worthiness,
Mm-hmm.
deservedness, learning true self-care. And when I talk about worthiness, I'm not talking about self-esteem. That's about the job you have, the car you drive, where you live, the image you present to the world. Worthiness is your universally given right to be the most brilliant version of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
to claim the fact that you deserve that. You deserve the life that you desire. And in order to get there, you've got to practice proper self-care. And proper self-care is about the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. So physical self-care,
Mm-hmm.
of course, is hygiene, getting yourself to the doctor, listening to your symptoms, understanding that any symptoms you're feeling are messages that are calling out for attention, following up on it, knowing that you deserve to go for a second opinion if you're not comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
finding that personal power to claim what is rightly yours. Mental self-care, keeping your brain sharp. Are you feeding your brain, or are you, as we said before, feeding your anxiety?
Mm-hmm.
How can you best engage in best brain health? Emotional self-care, feeling your feelings. Understand that you don't need to be happy all the time, and that the only way that feelings can help you, what is it Robert Frost said, the only way out is through?
Mm-hmm.
Express them. And then finally, spiritual self-care, understanding that you are here as part of the greater good
Mm-hmm.
and you deserve the blessings of the universe. The next block really follows up on that because it's about an unwillingness to sit in the discomfort, an unwillingness to sit in those feelings that you, for one reason or another, decided were too difficult for you to tolerate.
Mm-hmm.
So that takes exploration.
Right.
And that's a big part of the work I do. What is it about those feelings? Who will I be if I let myself feel these feelings? Who will I be if I let go of these behaviors in an effort to be the change I want to see?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big part of the coaching I do. Now, another block is mindset. Are we operating in a mindset of scarcity, which is really rooted in fear,
Right.
deprivation, restriction? Or are we operating in a mindset of abundance, which has us living in gratitude for what we have, not what we don't have, and for being willing to embrace the opportunity and the possibility of what's there, living as if. That's a big part of it. And
That's
finally, consistency, sticking with it, doing this every day so that you can come to trust the fact that you can honor your hunger. You can eat when you're hungry and stop when you've had enough. You can feel your feelings. You can engage in exercise that's appropriate for where you are right now. You can find your enough. And you can make sure that you nourish yourself with things that are not found in the kitchen.
So I kind of would feel like consistency would be one of the hardest blocks to work through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But that's why it's important to work
Mm-hmm.
with a coach, an
Mm-hmm.
accountability partner, engage in exercises that keep you accountable, whether
Mm-hmm.
it be journaling, having someone to connect with. That's a very big part of the recovery process.
Right.
Recovery from anything,
Right. Yeah.
being part of the greater good.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting to highlight and important to highlight those 4 blocks that you
Mm-hmm.
see, because just like any kind of addiction, with whether it be to food or alcohol or drugs, I mean, you hear that all the time, that, relapse is real. It's a hard, some relapses have worse consequences than others, but perpetuating that cycle with disordered eating, it's elusive, which, goes back to the point of the question. And those 4 blocks, I think, are really important to highlight, and that you spelled that out. And I think that'll be really, I think that'll resonate with the people who are listening a lot, to really
And
look into that.
I'm sorry for interrupting. The
That's,
possibility of relapse looms heavily.
mm-hmm.
And recovery from anything is not
Right.
linear.
Right.
It's not linear, especially when food is involved. You think about it. Our experience with food is our very first experience with being seen, heard, and nurtured,
Mm-hmm.
right? We survived the birth experience. We're wrapped up, held close, and we're fed.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first month of our lives, we have no sense of ego, no sense of autonomy. We're one with this caretaker who is basically keeping us alive with food.
Mm-hmm.
So when there is a bleep, for lack of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
or a misstep in that path of security and safety, a very disordered relationship with self can occur. And then in the limbic part of our brain are stored these memories of safety and security and being fed, which is why when people are upset and stressed, their mind remembers feel bad, eat, feel better.
Right.
So it's a question of breaking that cycle.
Right. And that goes back to, really dealing with consistency and the other blocks you mentioned, but really, seeking out someone like you who can help you through this process. And sometimes we tend to look for things outside of ourselves to make things better. But when we're going through the process of actively healing, we need someone to sort of check ourselves, to be able to highlight where we're going off course. And so that is why your programs and your processes are so, so valuable to people. And I love
Thank
that
you.
you are there for those people.
It's
So,
about going inward.
yes.
It's really about going inward because there's so much out there today for us, on every level,
Mm-hmm.
And yes, as you so brilliantly said, it's all outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We're constantly defining ourselves by things outside of ourselves when
Right.
that what I refer to as a sacred space of solitude is within us, and it's what we can always come home to. It's where
Mm-hmm.
we are really safe if we just allow ourselves to
Yeah.
believe that.
Yeah. So we touched on this a little bit, but I'd like you to define a little bit more clearly for people the difference between emotional or stress eating and binge eating disorder.
Okay. Um, Stress eating, compulsive overeating is very often um, driven by an urge, as I said before, feel bad, eat something, feel better. And
Mm-hmm.
very often it becomes habitual. It could even be, it's at the end of a tough day. It is taking that deep breath. For some people, it's a glass of wine. For other people, it's a pint or two of ice cream or a bag of chips. It's basically mindless eating.
Mm-hmm.
It's so that you are numbing, avoiding, and distracting yourself from the stresses of the day, for the emotion that you don't want to feel. Binge eating usually follows what we're talking about, the
Mm-hmm.
stress eating, the compulsive overeating, but it takes you further away from reality.
Okay.
People who engage in binge eating are often driven by a very strong urge. They lose a part of themselves to that urge. There's a voice that is calling for them. They are in another zone when they're involved in that binge. And it's certainly eating beyond the point of being comfortably full. Some people describe it as being in a food coma.
Mm-hmm.
Many people describe waking up in the morning with a food hangover, which is basically a result of blood sugar
Right.
dysregulation and microbiome disruption.
Right.
So, whereas disordered eating, many of the same behaviors are comparable to eating disorder behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
it's to a lesser degree.
Okay. Perfect. What are the various types of eating disorders that you work with?
Okay. Well, there's anorexia nervosa,
Mm-hmm.
which is characterized by a fear of fat, a fear of what food will do to you. It's characterized by severe restricting. And most times it's characterized by person being 85% of their ideal weight.
Okay.
However, I must clarify that with anorexia, with bulimia, and even binge eating disorder, um, you can present as a normal weight.
Okay.
So in these cases, it's really more of a distorted thinking
Okay.
mechanism. Bulimia nervosa is where somebody is engaging in that binge eating, but
Mm-hmm.
they're compensating with laxatives, vomiting, or compulsive overexercising to make up for the binge episode. And very often, bulimia is accompanied by periods of severe restricting as another way to compensate for the binge behavior. And
Okay.
very often, the severe restricting leads to the binge behavior. Um,
Right.
right, binge behavior has several causes. One of them is restricting, and the other, so that's more biological,
Sure.
physiological, and the other is purely psychological when it's, dealing with the desire to numb, avoid, and distract. Binge eating disorder is what I just described,
Mm-hmm.
compulsively overeating to the point of being overly full, totally mindless, but there is no compensatory
Mm-hmm.
behaviors following.
Okay. Just keep overeating
Yeah,
without thinking.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I could share a case study about a woman that I was working with who had a very high pressure job at a very prestigious law firm. And on her way home from her 14 to 16-hour days, she would order food from her phone to be delivered from when she got there. And it was very interesting because the woman suffers from celiac, but what was her go-to? Cheesy pasta. And
Mm,
she would eat to the point of being physically ill, and it didn't matter to her what her body was doing with the food that she was eating, and that she was very ill in the
mm-hmm.
morning. It was
But,
all about how the food was taking her away
mm-hmm.
from what she had so much trouble dealing with.
Wow. And there's something about, I mean, there's a lot of shame that comes with, disordered eating, eating disorders, and the behavior surrounding that. But it seems like it contributes even more to the elusivity of overcoming this, because we do need to eat to survive. And so it's always in our faces. It's going to always be a part of our life. So learning to live healthfully, using food in a healthy way is extra challenging, it seems like.
No question. And
Hmm.
that's where so much of the work is.
Hmm.
It's about trust. There's so much talk today about intuitive eating.
Hmm.
It's impossible to engage in intuitive eating if you don't trust your intuition.
Right.
So our job as practitioners is to help our clients and patients back it all up, understand where their behaviors are coming from, let go of these thought processes. I always say that transformation is less about what we do to change and more about what we let go of in an effort to be the change.
Hmm.
So as I said before, that's really where I start. That's the first phase of the work that I do with people, is where are these toxic beliefs and inflammatory thoughts that need to be eliminated coming from? And we do a lot of work, spend a lot of time on looking at how rational versus irrational they are. And this way we can, from that exploration, create tools in order to manage the triggers and to manage the fears, and help our clients and patients make healthy food decisions
Hmm.
based on what they know is true for them.
Right. That's perfect. Um, how has your personal and clinical experience with recovery impacted and influenced the work that you're doing today? And then I want you to talk about your book a little bit too.
Okay. Well, my personal experience with recovery
Hmm.
was one that was totally unsustainable. As I said before,
Right.
I was a chronic restrictor, although I did have occasions of overeating, but I was addicted to laxatives.
Okay.
So even when I was restricting, I was purging. And as a result of that, I ended up with serious GI dysfunction and blood sugar dysfunction. And we all know that the systems
Hmm.
of the body are all connected. So it also affected me hormonally. There's a time in my life where my adrenals were practically flatlined.
Right.
So through exploration and a lot of gut healing protocols, I had to slowly learn what my body could handle. So it wasn't so much about what I was eating, it was about what my body was doing with what I was eating. And
Okay.
that's what I hope to put out there. I wrote a blog post once, and I think it was a social media post about, I thought I was eating the healthiest food on earth, but my body didn't agree.
Hmm.
My body wasn't doing well with an apple. My body wasn't doing well with raw food. My body wasn't doing well with fermented foods. My body
Right.
wasn't doing well with everything that the pundits told me I should have been
Right.
eating.
That are the healthy things that will save
Exactly.
you. Yeah.
Exactly. So how my experience with recovery has guided the work I do with my clients is that it is extremely bio-individual. I
Hmm.
don't prescribe to any one diet. The only thing that is, I would say, one size fits all is the philosophy that we need to look at our stories. We need to turn the page on what is no longer serving us.
Hmm.
And we need to be accepting of the blank page where we can start to write our happily ever after.
Right. I love
And we
that.
need to be willing to experiment and explore. And we need to also accept that some days our bodies are going to be more accepting of certain foods than others, and that's
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds pretty amazing. And what, like you said, it's, you don't subscribe to any one way of eating for every single person you deal with. It's therapeutic, it's case by case, but your underlying core of your process is the same. And I think that that definitely applies. You know, we need to really get in there and dig into the why behind where our eating disorder, disorder
Exactly.
eating, binging came from. So
Exactly. Very
can
true.
can you tell us about your book, The Freedom Promise?
Absolutely. My freedom promise was born out of my experience, but more from an emotional and mental perspective.
Okay.
It wasn't until after I wrote the book that I pursued the certification in functional nutrition. In fact, my goal this year is to do an updated edition. But
Awesome.
the book highlights my 7 steps to food freedom, which is my
Perfect.
signature framework. And it's an acronym for freedom. Step 1, find your enough, face your feelings. Step 2, rest and digest. Step 3, eat when you're hungry, stop when you've had enough. Step 4, eat mindfully. 5, do something every day to make your body feel alive. Only eat whole foods as often as you can, and make sure you surround yourself with what truly nourishes. And while the first step, finding your enough, is that foundation,
Hmm.
it's really the ultimate goal,
Hmm.
because recovery from anything is about relationships. And it's that relationship to self that is reflected in our relationship to everything else.
Right. That's great. That's fabulous. Everybody should be picking that book up.
Oh, thank you. And in that
Yeah.
book, every step, every chapter starts with an anecdotal story of my own recovery and my own experience, my own insanity, what it was like for
Mhm.
me, and
Right.
ends with a journal question and action steps, affirmations, and recommendations for further reading. And then I took this book as an outline and created an online course, um, which is called Stop Fearing Food, Start Loving Your Body, an unconventional approach to say goodbye to your disordered eating for good. And that has the functional nutrition component and lots of other goodies.
Okay. And they can find that at your website. Is that
Yes,
correct?
if they'll find that on my website. I have a bunch of freebies. I have a guide which outlines the 7 steps that I just described. I
Okay.
have a free master class which invites you to the online course.
Okay. Perfect. And I'll put all your contacts in the show notes for your social media, and your website is thefreedompromise.com.
That's correct.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to share with us, or how we can
Just
access
that,
you?
um, again, transformation is less about what we do to change and more about what we let go of in an effort to be the change. And that's the most important thing we can remember.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tiffany. I really enjoyed being with you.
Thank you.